it's a very rich history, and the history around the Brown Bess, you know, the things that are all in context with it, really is a rich history. It's a bit, and what I love about it so much is such a human history. It's a wonderful human history. My name's Dave Person, and I do quite a bit of demos and seminars here at the Gunmakers Fair. I've done this for years. I'm closely associated with the American Long Rifle site, the ALR site. And on ALR, I'm known as Smart Dog, and I'm known by my name on the Muzzleloading forum. This is a talk I wanted to do for a long, long time. I tend to focus on British work. I love British work, but I love more than just British work. I love the British gun trade, particularly in the 18th century. It's a rich history, it's a fascinating history, and I really have fun digging into some of the details, getting into the weeds with not just what was made, but why they were made, how they were made, and what they were made for. And it really is a worthwhile endeavor to do some research into Brown Bess and the King's Musket. I am very much involved in making Brown Besses and other military arms from the 18th century. Primarily for reenactors, but also for museums and also for private individuals who just want to have a copy of something. I have been studying this stuff for quite a number of years, and I found two things that have really surprised me. One, not so surprising, there's a great deal of mythology about the British gun trade, but also particularly the King's Musket, the Brown Bess. But there's also a great deal of interest in it, and it surprises me that there are so many people who want to know something about Brown Bess or want to own one, want to shoot one, and they're not all reenactors. Many of them are people who just want to have one to shoot, maybe even hunt with. And it's surprising to me that there's that much interest. You don't see that same kind of interest in the French muskets, the Charlevoix, the Saint Etiennes, and others. Not quite as much, but the Brown Bess has a pastiche. It's known kind of a romance, and that romance, to some extent, is deserved. In other cases, it's a bit of a myth. But we're going to delve into that today. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history of the Brown Bess, pretty short, and then I'm going to get into how my shop, the Braintree Hill Gun Shop, makes Brown Besses. I think a lot of those details will be of interest to any of you who have attempted, either if you own a reproduction like a Petter Soli or a Moroku Brown Bess, or you have intentions of making it. I think this information is going to be of really use to many of you. Okay, so the Brown Bess, history and how to make it. So the first question that comes, I love Brown Bess. I mean, I really do love Brown Bess, and you always have to wonder, you know, why was it called Brown Bess? I guess in the British military, if you were known as Hugging Brown Bob, that probably would have raised a lot of eyebrows. But Hugging Brown Bess seemed a little bit more appropriate. And basically what it was is that the Brown Bess was English slang from the 18th century and even a little bit earlier. It technically means a plain woman of low repute. Now, there's a lot of mythology about Brown Besses. There's the name. Some have said it's an allusion to Good Queen Bess, you know, in the 17th century. That doesn't make any sense. You're talking about, you know, 200 years prior, or 150 years prior. Sometimes it's thought to be sort of a German derivation, you know, Brown Busse, meaning brown gun. No, they didn't have to go to Germany to get the slang. The slang was right in England. And then some people think of it as an allusion to a weapon and farmer's tool called a brown bill that was commonly used. And no, that had nothing to do with the Brown Bess. When linguists have looked at this and the Royal Armories have looked at this, they basically found whatever documentation they can find strongly suggests that it always meant to be Bess, meaning a plain woman of low repute, perhaps even a prostitute, but certainly of low repute, or at least plain, and brown, meaning drab or plain. So it means a plain woman. And when you're a British recruit, that is probably on the left is what you had in mind for being a romantic soldier going into the British Army. The reality is you probably ended up with a true Brown Bess on the left-hand side with maybe 2 kids and an angry mother who says, why aren't you supporting your children? So that is probably the reality for the British soldier. Brown Bess had good and probably negative connotations. So let me just talk about the evolution of the gun. Oh, by the way, again, with Brown Bess, you don't say the Brown Bess. You don't say you have a Brown Bess. It is no article in front. It's always Brown Bess. So if you join the British Army, you are married to Brown Bess. That's why Thackeray wrote that in his book, his story, The Luck of Barry Lyndon. The old common saying, you're marching and hugging Brown Bess. You're not hugging the Brown Bess. You're hugging a Brown Bess. You are hugging Brown Bess. Remember that. Anybody says the Brown Bess out there, my dog is going to rip your lips off. Evolution of the musket. Where did it come from? Oh, this is a great history, and it's one that's going to surprise some of you. And even though some of you may really know a lot about Brown Besses, oftentimes the details are missing. Much of information I have here comes right out of DeWitt Bailey's PhD thesis. So it's some really interesting stuff. So in the late 1600s to the early first quarter of the 18th century, generally the way the British soldier was armed was by his regimental colonel. The colonel was given money by the government to go out and contract with private contractors, almost universally from London, the London Gunmakers Guild. And they would have a few standards like bore, maybe barrel length a little bit, but by and large, the standards are pretty lax. And the colonel could get almost whatever gun he wanted, and generally they tried to go cheap and pocket the extra money. So the quality of the guns came to be a problem. But there was also another problem, big problem, and that is during the glorious revolution of 1688, when William of Orange became the King of England, took it away from the Catholic Stuarts, the Protestant Dutch. Because he was so involved with fighting the French in the Netherlands, he started involving England in those continental wars. Now, prior to that, England really didn't care about the rest of Europe. It was a fairly isolated place, and they basically only concerned themselves with their own concerns, the old civil war that they had, the new restoration of the monarchy. So getting tied up with European wars was not in their cards. For that, they didn't really need big armies. They had these local armies, regimentals, basically local regiments, kind of amateurish and relatively small in numbers. And when William Orange took over and started involving England in these continental wars, now they needed an army, and they needed to arm the armies. And this only got worse into the 18th century with Queen Anne, and then particularly with King George I, who was a German. And he owned lands in Hanover. And he actually cared more about those lands in Hanover than he did in England. In fact, he didn't speak English, he spoke German. And he involved Britain in these continental wars. And it just became the case that England had to step up, build bigger armies, much bigger armies, and the colonial regimental system, the colonel regimental system of arming just didn't work. It just wasn't going to work. And so beginning in the early part of the 18th century, the British Ordnance started devising a system called the Ordnance System to try to arm its troops. And the Ordnance System ultimately became something quite different than actually ordering complete muskets from a series of builders, like in London, usually almost universally from London. It was they would have contractors and private companies, private makers, make parts. Then they would store those parts, and when there was a need for muskets, when there were warrants that come down from the government that we need 10,000 muskets, then the Tower of London and its complementary organization in Ireland called Dublin Castle would set up or assemble those muskets into muskets, those parts into muskets. Now those parts may be in storage for a long time. So when you see a Brown Bess musket and it has on a lock plate, it says Edge the name of the contractor, or Grice, the name of the contractor, and it has a date, maybe 1762 or 1747 or some date. That is the date the lock was made or accepted by the British government, not the date the musket was set up. So that musket might have been set up 10 years later. So you can't date Brown Besses by their lock plates. You have to know something about the other parts of the gun and when that gun might have been actually set up. The process of developing a standard British musket, that became a priority for the government. And they, through the first quarter of the 18th century, they attempted to promote private contractors, providing them with examples, prototypes, that they might ultimately select as a standard musket. And one of the most influential and one of the most, one of the individuals who had the most effect on what the Brown Bess became in terms of its ultimate evolution was Andries Dollop. Dollop was from the Netherlands, and he was an immigrant from the Netherlands. And the local gunsmith, the London gunsmiths, hated him, persecuted him, because he was from a foreign land, and he was a much better gunmaker than most of those guys. And he had very wealthy, powerful patrons. But he also produced a series of prototypes, Brown Bess, that eventually became and incorporated many of the details that the later Brown Bess, the one that was actually selected, actually incorporated. So they began the ordnance system. It took a bit of time, and the key player here was Richard Wooldridge. I was going to say Robert. Richard Wooldridge. Anybody who loves Brown Bess or who has an English passport owes Richard Wooldridge a tremendous debt. He must have been a pretty amazing individual. He was a very good gunmaker, but he also was a really good promoter of the King's policy for developing the new ordnance system. And he demanded, for example, that the London gunmakers follow patterns, make the components, have them inspected, make them up to templates and patterns issued by the government. And the London gunmakers hated them because they didn't want some government hack telling them how to make guns. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? What ended up happening is Wooldridge didn't back down, and he had the backing of the government, complete backing of the government. And it's that attempt by the London gunmakers to divorce themselves from Wooldridge and the ordnance system. This became what we call the Great Schism in the gun trade in England, because the ace in the hole for the government was to say, screw you to the London gunmakers, we're going to Birmingham. Because the Birmingham makers were very interested in providing the parts and components and were much more amenable to the British inspections and standards. And so the gun trade, particularly the heavy parts of it, the lock making and barrel making, went to Birmingham. And this began the Great Schism, in that London gunmakers were known for quality high-end sporting guns. Birmingham made most of the export and most of the cheaper guns and the military guns. The London gunmakers had the prestige, the Birmingham makers made fortunes. And so it was quite a schism in terms of how the British gun trade was perceived and operated. But at one point in time, later in the 18th century, there were a quarter of the workforce in Birmingham, people working in Birmingham, were in the gun trade, some part of the gun trade. So it was a major, major industry, particularly for Birmingham. So there was a backlash from the London makers that began this schism. And eventually, Wooldridge engages Louis Barber, a French immigrant, to make a series of prototypes of Brown Bess muskets to be selected by King George I to become the Brown Bess. And in that process, he made 13 steel or iron-mounted, long-barreled, 46-inch long barrel Brown Besses, and we were Brown Besses yet, prototypes. And he made 6 short-barreled ones, 42-inch barrels, kind of like shortland pattern Bess, with brass fittings. And these were placed in front of King George I, and he selected what he wanted. And he wanted the long barrel version, but with brass mountings. And that became the Brown Bess musket, the King's pattern musket that we know, the first pattern. And it truly was the King's pattern, because he selected it.
And ultimately, this became, in 1730, the very first pattern Brown Bess. Okay, so we're going to talk about these patterns. So if you're going to build any Brown Besses or appreciate a reproduction that you might have or somebody it makes for you, you need to know how these things looked and what they were called and what their changes occurred over time. We do not speak anymore of Brown Besses as models. You're going to see first model, second model, third model. That was a label placed on the musket by collectors, maybe it's in the late 1800s, maybe in the early 20th century, as a way to kind of organize the Besses that they were seeing, collecting. The British never referred to them as models. They were always referred to as the King's pattern, the old pattern, or the new pattern. And DeWitt Bailey has done great research ascribing numbers, dates, to those patterns. So he's allowed the pattern designation to evolve into a really good designation that really has a timeline that we can follow in terms of the changes. And he did that by actually delving into the British records, going to the warrants, and looking at the specifications and seeing where changes were made over time. We have two major divisions in British muskets. You have land muskets and you have sea service muskets. So the Brown Bess was known as a land musket. You have another designation, which you'll see in the future when we get to the next series of patterns, but you have long land and you have short land pattern muskets. Long land had the 46-inch barrels, short land had 42-inch barrels. And we'll get into some of those differences in a little bit. But we're going to start with the long land pattern. The first pattern is the pattern 1730. This was basically what King George I agreed on and selected. 46-inch barrel, you have a convex heavy side plate. You have a lock that originally had no bridle on the frizzen. It was a bridleless frizzen. But the shape of the lock is a little bit of a banana shape. You can see it has a fairly steep curve downward. It was brass mounted, had a swell by the rear ramrod pipe. That swell was often for a good hand grip. It also has, it's cut back for a bayonet. And the original versions had a fairly weak trigger guard like the one you see here, which is very Dutch in shape. And they all had wooden ramrods. What you see in front of you is a conversion over time. They found very quickly they wanted steel or iron ramrods in service. They also found that the trigger guard was too weak, and they also found that they needed some protection for the muzzle. So in this case, you'll see that top musket there is a pattern 1730. The regimental armorer has added a nose band to that, a brass nose band, to provide some protection from the bayonet. And it's been retrofitted with a steel ramrod at some time in its service life. But originally it would have had a wood rod. This is one I built. This is what we would call an upgraded version of the pattern 1730. This is probably the version that showed up first in North America, the only version that may have showed up in North America with Ogilvy's expedition to Georgia in 1737. So this is probably, if you're looking at Brown Bess muskets that were used in North America, this is probably the first kind that came here. So it would be a 1730 that had been upgraded. They changed the trigger guard to the standard guard that they would use for virtually for the next 100 years. They put a bridle on the lock, pan bridle on the lock, and they generally would always fit a brass noseband onto these guys. And many were converted to steel ramrods. Here you see the typical configuration, the swell at the rear ramrod pipe. You also have a thumb plate and a long extension on the butt plate. That's typical of the longland pattern muskets. Something to understand about that swell. If you look at it from the bottom, kind of looks about the size of a small orange, maybe a large lemon. All right, but you look at it in profile from the side. The swell does not extend down. The bottom of the stock is fairly flat. This shows a little bit of a bulge here because of the tang from the ramrod pipe. But basically the profile of the wood is pretty flat. The bulge does not droop down very much. So it's really two-dimensional, it's just horizontal. The next pattern that came along, and this is the pattern that is the workhorse of the French and Indian War. This is the long land pattern of 1742. As Goldstein calls it, this is the Mack truck of Brown Besses because it is big. If you go to Fort Ty or any collection of Valley Forge or down to Colonial Williamsburg and you look at pattern 42s, you'll be like, holy cow, I can't believe those little guys in the 18th century carried these things. This was a big gun, and it still has the same side plate. It has the banana lock, the banana-shaped lock. It has a bridle on the lock, but I'm going to go back for a moment. You notice on the earlier pattern, there's carving around the lock panels, a beaver tail, a shield in front, and underneath you can see the wavy lines underneath, which are moldings, decorative moldings. They're just decorative. They have no real function other than decoration. Well, by 1742, they got rid of that. They simplified everything. You can see there's no beaver tails there. The shaping around the lock panels is a lot simpler and in many ways cruder. So, you know, they were really getting down to now production and reducing the cost of these guns. And a lot of that cost reduction was made by the private contractors because they could make a little more money. The price didn't change, but they could cut some of the workload and they could make a little more money. And this was part of the negotiation that went on. When any new pattern was put on or any new warrant was set out to build muskets, those private contractors would actually come back and negotiate price and amounts, and it was a public-private partnership. The next one, the last longland pattern, is the pattern 1756. Now, there's a couple variations before this. I'm not going to talk about those because they probably didn't find much of their way to North America, and they're really kind of not very important in terms of the differences, is what some people call pattern 1748. No, I'm going to jump right to the 56. This is the last longland pattern. This is a gun that changed the lock substantially. The bottom is not straight, but it's a lot less curved. There is a pan bridle. You'll notice, as with all the previous locks, there's only one screw showing behind the flintcock. That's going to be significant as we get on to later patterns of Brown Bess. The big convex side plate, they retain the same trigger guard. There's a cast brass nose cap. It's no longer a band of brass, sheet brass that's been bent around. It's actually cast. Steel ramrod. This gun was made for steel ramrods, unlike the previous ones, which were all made for wooden rods and sometimes converted to steel. This was made from the outgo for steel rods, so the diameter, inside diameter of all those pipes is much narrower, so it can fit the steel rod rather than a wooden rod. And this was the last longland pattern, and these were made from the late 1750s all the way up through the Revolutionary War, and probably during the early years of the American Revolution, this was going to be the most common form of musket you're going to see used by British troops. Slowly they'll change to the next pattern as we talk, but this would have been the major player in the early part of the war. It was also carried by grenadiers generally throughout the entire war, but it was replaced eventually by a shorter version. This was never used in the French and Indian War. That's a mistake that a lot of people have. Pattern 1756 may have showed up in North America, maybe earliest during Pontiac's Rebellion after the French and Indian War, but it was not a part of the French and Indian War. The workhorse pattern musket for the French and Indian War was the previous one, the pattern 1742. Okay, so they decided to make a change in the late 1760s. They decided they wanted to make a shorter, smaller, and handier musket. And the first one that they adopted is called the 1769. However, I put 1757 as a date there because the first real short-barreled gun that was adopted for any wide production, and that really kind of looks like the shorter barrel, what we call the shortland muskets, was the Marina Militia musket that came out in the late 1750s, 1757. And that musket was a cost cutter, and it had no rear tailpipe, for the ramrod pipe. It didn't have a muzzle cap. It had a wooden rod, had no thumb piece. It had a different butt plate, and the butt plate had, rather than a lug for a cross pin to hold the top return down, it actually had a screw that goes down. And it was not finished quite as well. But it is truly what we would call the first real shortland musket. Although typically we recognize as the next pattern I'm going to talk about as the first infantry shortland musket that was issued. And this is the pattern 69. Now, if you have a Morocco Brown Bess, a Japanese Brown Bess, or you have a Pedersoli Brown Bess, this is the pattern that they purport to be. And unfortunately, not all that well. But this is the pattern they purport to be. The pattern 69, and you've got now a 42-inch barrel, steel ramrod, trumpet front ramrod pipe, with a very profoundly flared, and that comes from the 1756. The earlier pattern also had that trumpet pipe. The swell at the wrist is smaller, trigger guard's the same, a flat side plate, no longer convex, a flat side plate, and that's right off the Marina Militia musket. And then you have a lock the same as that previous pattern, the last longland pattern, and these guns were then issued beginning in the early 1770s, and many of them that showed up in North America were first issued through the Irish establishment because the troops came from Ireland. So a lot of these, rather than being labeled Tower on the lock, they would say Dublin Castle. And none of these would have a date because the practice of putting a date and a contractor's name or tower and a date on the backs of the lock plate, that ended in 1764. The British stopped doing it. So these guys, so the Pedersoli, for example, the reproduction Pedersoli, has a Grice 1762 lock. Totally wrong. Their shortland pattern musket should just say Tower and no date. Or it should say Dublin Castle and no date. So they got it wrong. In any way, these muskets became important in the early part of the Revolutionary War from the Irish establishment. And by mid-war and late war, these were the dominant guns that were being issued to the British troops through the rest of the Revolutionary War. The last pattern I'm going to talk about, relevant to our discussion, is the pattern 1777. It's just an upgrade of the previous pattern, small upgrade. It's got a couple changes that are important. Is now you see two screws showing up behind the flintcock. That means that the sear spring, the spring that operates the sear, is now a short length, so that the screw that holds it to the lock plate actually is exposed behind the flintcock. The earlier lock plates have a long sear spring, and that is hidden behind the flintcock, so you don't see it. That's a significant change that tells you right off the bat, when you see that, even if all the other markings are gone, you know this was made after 1777 or so, in terms of the date of the musket and the lock itself. It also contains the Pratt second thimble, which has a slight flare. You notice there's a big trumpet in the front. This one also has a slight flare, the second thimble. That's to make it easier to get the ramrod down in there, in battle conditions. And those are really the only major changes, although you can also see there's a hole in the top jaw screw, which was something you could put a bar in so you could tighten down your flint a little bit more easily and really tight. And that was basically the only change that they made in this one. There's a couple other variations. I'm not going to talk about them because they're not that important, but there were some war emergency changes that were made during the Revolutionary War. The British were running out of firearms. And so they had other contract. They had a Liège contract, and we have a Liège musket over here. They also had contracts with some German makers. They also had contracts with British gun makers to go back to making now complete muskets instead of just the component parts because they were running out of guns. So now you got all that background information. We're all Brown Bess experts now. And now you want to make one. Or you have a reproduction or somebody's made one, and you just kind of want to look at it and evaluate it. Just how historically accurate is it? Well, I'm going to show you some of the details. I'm not going to do all of them, but I'm going to show you a fair number of details that you want to to take into consideration about the gun, the King's musket. And there is my apprentice Maria. She's working on a Brown Bess, in fact, she's working on a Brown Besses as we speak right now. Anyway, so I'm going to go on. The first problem you run into making a Brown Bess is that of getting components. Unfortunately, the only real game in town is the rifle shop in Oklahoma. They do have component parts that are historically accurate, good quality, just takes forever to get them from them, they really are the only game in town. Most of the other sources of parts just don't have the right stuff. And just to give you a sense of how different the right stuff is from a lot of the reproduced stuff, that is an original casting from an original short-land pattern Brown Bess musket, the one on top. That butt is from a Pedersoli reproduction. You can see how much bigger the original butt plate is. It's a lot bigger. And I'll just give you a sense of it for scale. I'm gonna have to put this microphone down, Ethan. This is a Japanese Bess reproduction, Moroku, okay? And it has pretty good quality parts. You can turn these into pretty good reproductions if you work at it, okay? Look at the difference. This is an original Brown Bess. It's a Liège contract when the government went to Belgium to get guns in a hurry. Look at the difference in the butt plate size and the width as well, all right? Now, that might seem 3/8 of an inch or so, may seem small, but it is not in terms of the profile of the stock. It makes a huge difference. These look like they have little butts and big locks, and these are much better proportioned. So it makes a huge difference to get the right parts. If you want a gun to look historically accurate, you really don't have much choice but to either fabricate parts yourself, get them from the rifle shop, this goes on when we get to the locks as well. We deal with locks. These are 3 guns that I worked over. That is a Pedersoli Bess. I'm going to argue that may be the most attractive Pedersoli Bess you'll ever see. But that gun has a Pedersoli shortland pattern lock on it. The markings are wrong. The border lines are wrong. It's a little bit small for an original Bess, but it's okay. It's pretty good. You can work them over and turn them into a pretty good representative of a Brown Bess, of the original Brown Besses. It just takes a bit of work to make the Pedersoli work. You got to work over the lock components. One thing to understand is not one single reproduction, commercial reproduction of the Brown Besses made today, Japanese, Italian, or Indian made, not one of them would have passed British ordnance. They all would have failed. They would never have gotten to first base because they simply aren't of high enough quality. The British made these guns well, even though cosmetically they took corner. They didn't finish them all that well. They didn't make sure that every edge is nice, sharp, crisp, and lock panels, things like that. No, but the stuff that mattered, how the locks were inlet, how they were made, that they did to a very high standard, much higher than we do today in these reproduction locks. So you have to deal with, what do you do about locks? All right, well, you can convert a Pedersoli. This one, the second one up on the right, that's a Japanese Moroku lock, which is a very good choice as a reproduction. It has a slightly better shape to it. You still have to get rid of the markings and rework it. This is one that I turned into a Dublin Castle lock, and Jim knows all about this, because I did one for Jim. And it's so it's a Moroku lock that I've turned into a Dublin Castle with a lot of welding and a lot of filing. But the one thing about the Morokus, which is really helpful, is that the quality of the castings and the quality of the steel is the best you'll ever find in the world. The Japanese steel was terrific. So if you treat a Moroku as if it's a 3/4 finished kit, you can turn that lock into a really good Bess lock, one that would pass inspection. It just takes a bit of working them over. The bottom one is a hand-built lock that I made from rifle shop parts. And the truth is that really, it's possible that your best bet is actually to go and build the lock yourself from rifle shop parts. And I do want to say, make a recommendation here, and then an endorsement. If there is a lock to build, to learn to build locks, there's nothing better than a Brown Bess, because it's so bloody big that you have a lot of margin for error. So it's really a good one to learn to build. All the parts are big. You can see how everything works. You know, in a big, even if your eyesight's pretty bad, you know, you can see kind of how it's working. The worst lock in the world to ever learn to build as a first lock is a pistol lock. You don't want to go there with a pistol lock. You better be a clockmaker before you go there. But a Brown Bess is big. You got a lot of margin, a lot of extra metal for margin of error, and building the lock from the rifle shop part sets is not that hard. It's good to have a drill press, but that's really all you need is a drill press. You could probably get by with a hand drill if you were just really, really careful. And I have built quite a number of these, and they work very, very well. The Brown Bess lock is a good sparking lock. The originals were expected to ignite the pan 40 times in a row with one flint, and not without a misfire. Now the French lock on the what we call the Model 63, or the lights, actually the Light 63s, which we call the Model 66. That lock probably was the best flintlock ever put on a musket. And the French expected that lock to produce 120 consecutive ignitions with 3 flints without a misfire. These guns were not unreliable. When you go to a reenactment and you see half those reenactors' guns not firing, it's because those guys do not know anything about their flintlocks, and they do not know how to care for them. These guns, when you pull the trigger, they went off. And it's because, guess what? These guys' lives depended on it. This wasn't, you know, a game. This wasn't a prop. This was a real living thing they had to use to fight a war with. So they demanded some quality and some reliability. The first step to building a Bess, of course, is to do a drawing. You can buy plans. The rifle shop sells some pretty good plans. For early guns, I think Track has a pretty nice set of plans. If you go with the Track plans, realize the gun that they've got there is kind of, I suspect it wasn't based on an original. I think it was based on somebody's interpretation of original. It's a little bit bulky and clumsy for the originals, but it's pretty good. You know, it's a good plan for you to sort of use as a start. The other thing about those plans is that you really need to fit your components carefully, because the Bess, things fit tight. There's not a lot of extra wood there. There's extra wood there where it needs to be for strength, but you know, when you look along the barrel channel, there's not a whole lot of extra wood along the barrel channel. It's pretty thin. The ramrod, you know, not a lot of extra room to fit that ramrod. So you gotta get things pretty precise. And I would recommend you do a drawing. Always do a drawing. And I'm going to give you some dimensions and some architecture to help you make those drawings and those designs. So these are not universal dimensions, but they are representative of the patterns of muskets, and pretty much for all the patterns. There's some minor changes, but by and large, pretty much for all the patterns. The thickness of the breech area, the height of that breech area, they're pretty damn big. And that's, you know, at least 2 inches, 2 1/16 inches. I've seen as much as 2 1/8. It's a fairly substantial height of the breech. So they're not little guns. They're pretty good sized guns. And you can see over there, that Liège contract gun, it's a pretty darn big gun. The stock, the wrist then narrows to the comb, to the tip of the comb, to about 1 7/8. So just a slight narrowing. So it comes back and it pinches together. Not parallel sided. The top and bottom come together and get pinched just a little bit, just before the comb. And that curve down begins just about at the trigger. So about at the trigger, you start curving that stock down and bringing the comb, the top of the wrist down to the comb to a little bit of a narrower height. The actual comb itself is generally between 8 and 9 inches, though 8.5 is probably a good average for the height of the comb. And here's one of the keys to getting a Brown Bess right. And this is universal. The top of that comb, if you draw a straight line through the top of that comb, it will come right through the lock and just about through the center of the screw that holds the flintcock on. It's usually just a little bit below it. Every single Bess you encounter is going to be something that's going to be close to that. And if you don't do that, you're going to end up getting the actual look of it, the profile. You're not going to get it quite right. You've got to come fairly close to that rule to get these guns right. Now, the earlier Brown Besses, the earlier patterns, the 1730, maybe the 1742, they tended to have a little more drop at heel. In other words, distance down from the line of sight here down to the top of the butt plate. They tend, if you want a gun, a Brown Bess for shooting, for plinking, God forbid, hunting, for the Brown Bess, you might be more interested in those earlier patterns because the stocks have a little bit more drop to them. As the patterns emerged into the short land, they got straighter and straighter and straighter. So sometimes these later models, it's hard to get your cheek down on them because the stocks are pretty straight. But the architecture of having that comb line up with the flintcock bolt screw head on the lock, that is pretty well universal no matter how much of the drop there is in the drop at heel drop at the heel. Generally, the barrel tangs are about 2 3/8 inches. This is pretty common, pretty consistent, and about 11/16 in width. They are flared, straight flared, and oftentimes they're just flat. Sometimes there's a slight curve to them. Oftentimes they're just flat on top, like you see in a lot of American long rifles. The barrels on a Brown Bess are surprisingly easy to inlet. And the reason why they're surprisingly easy to inlet is because for most of their length, they're just a straight tube. Almost all of the taper at the breech is done within the first 12 inches of the barrel. And so that's the place you got to kind of deal with, the fact that the barrel is what we call a tapered or swamp. When you get below that, the tube is pretty straight. So you can really cut them out pretty quick, either with planes that have a round bottom cutter or with a router table, a router with a round bottom cutter. You can even use a dado cutter on a table saw and then use hand chisels gouges to round the bottom of it. But for a good portion of the length of the Brown Bess barrel, it's going to be pretty close to being a straight tube. And as a result of that, it's relatively easy to inlet. You don't have this lot of change in dimensions as you get towards the breech. When you get right towards the breech, however, yes, you do. You have a fairly substantial change. And often on the originals, that breech is about 1.25 inches in diameter. It's a big breech. None of the reproduction barrels are even close to that. So if you use a Morocco barrel or a Pedersoli barrel, which I do quite a bit to build these Besses, I know I'm building a gun though that the breech dimension is going to be a little shy of the originals. And so I compensate with the wood. I make the wood around it a little bit thicker. So I have the wrist the right size. But basically these barrels are not hard to inlet at all. Brown Bess, the first thing you do, and especially if you're using any kind of commercially made breech plug, you notice you'll see a lot of breech plugs. They have this little intersection here. There'll be a radius the way it was machined. Pedersoli is the same, but even when you get a breech plug from the rifle shop on one of their barrels, you'll see that as well because it's been machined. Get rid of that stinking thing. Get rid of that radius. That makes inletting a breech plug just a nightmare. The best thing to do is file it away, make it a right angle, and you'll find that it'll inlet so much easier for you. And in fact, the originals were that way as well. The other thing here is that for barrel lugs, on a Brown Bess, there are 3 pins that hold the barrel in place, and another lug that is there for the sling swivel, the forward sling swivel. Most of your reproductions do not have that lug for the sling swivel. The sling swivel on those reproductions like that Morocco just go through the wood. There's no support for the barrel. The barrel is really supported or is anchored to the stock by those other 3 pinned lugs rather than the swing swivel. Swing swivel has to be loose so that the swivel works. So it's really not going to be a tight fit through the lug like you have your other barrel pins. So that it's anchored by that, and it's anchored by a bolt that comes through the tang that goes down into your trigger plate. Kind of a standard way. Now, they generally were brazed on the barrel. What you'll find on most originals is that the lug itself is not curved on the bottom for a round barrel. they're flat, because they actually cut a little flat dovetail in the barrel first, put the lug in there, and then braze it in place on the originals. It's quite all right just to solder them on. I do that all the time, but if you're trying to really match the exact copy of an original, you're going to dovetail that in to a very shallow dovetail, and then you're going to solder it or braze it if you really want to go that far. But I would recommend just soldering it. The lock is always inlet superbly. In fact, probably better than most of you have encountered on your American long rifles that people have made for you, or that you made yourself. They only took out as much wood as they actually absolutely had to. It is extremely high quality, and in particular, in this case, the lower one, if I took an original Brown Bess lock from that time period, I could probably drop it right in there and it would fit. These are cut exactly like the originals, and it's worth learning how these are cut. Get Goldstein's book, Goldstein and Mowbray's book, and I would thoroughly recommend that you copy that inlay because it's very high quality and it takes out only as much wood as is absolutely necessary for the strength of the gun. The ramrod pipes, one of the details you have to remember about the ramrod pipes, obviously some are going to be big for wood rods, some are going to be narrow for steel rods, some are going to be converted. You're going to have a bushing in there to convert it from wood to steel. But one important thing is that the second ramrod pipe, the sling swivel, the forward sling swivel should overlap that pipe when it drops. The reason for that is if it didn't, the sling itself and the sling swivel will block the ramrod groove. So when you're trying to get your ramrod back in there in the middle of battle, you might be fighting your sling to get it through. It should drop onto a pipe so it does not block the ramrod. And that you always want to make sure if you're designing this, you always make sure that happens. This shows a barrel band on the front on the earlier Bess patterns. It's just thin sheet brass that's folded around, and then the tabs are folded onto the barrel channel walls. And it's held together with a rivet. Very simple, and it's basically 0.04 thousandths brass. It's really thin brass. This shows you a cast nose cap, which of course the later patterns we're using. The cast nose cap is easy to fit. They're really easy to fit, and they're held in place either by a brass or iron rivet. When you fit the ramrod groove and the web of wood between the barrel and the ramrod groove, the Besses aren't big in the front. They are tapered fairly nicely so that ramrod pretty well tucks up against that nose cap. There's not a big gap there. There can be some gap. Some are real tight, some are a little bit looser. But they fit down pretty tight. There's not a lot of extra wood. If you go and look at an India-made version, you're going to see that web of wood is so huge and that ramrod is so much lower than the barrel. You know, it really looks clumsy. Really, you look at these muskets, particularly the Liège musket, and there's nothing clumsy about that musket. It's big and robust, but it's still got an elegance, and things are fitting fairly close together here. There's not a lot of excess wood anywhere. The other thing is the trigger plate. The trigger plate, the slot for the trigger should be offset to the right, closer to the lock. That allows the trigger to engage the sear in the lock closer to the lock plate, and allows for a less mushy trigger pull. Plus, because the wrist is so big and thick, it allows a sear that isn't extremely long to actually engage with the trigger. So the trigger plate always has that offset to the right. I'm just going across details about, I'm not trying to teach you how to make a gun. I'm just going to go covering specific details to a Brown Bess. Here's another feature that you won't see in the reproductions, which you should be seeing, is the trigger plate. The rear end of the trigger plate should also be engaged in the screw, the bolt that goes through the wrist and holds the wrist plate on. So that screw is right here, right there, and it should go through the end of the trigger plate and go through the stock and thread into that hole right there for the wrist plate. Unfortunately, nobody makes them that way. The Pedersolis and the Morokus, the bolt is too far back because they got the architecture of the stock wrong, and so you don't really have it positioned right. But on original Bess, you should have that bolt at the end of the trigger plate, and then it should hit the wrist plate or thumb plate, and you'll notice that there is not much distance between the comb end and the end of the apron, the carved apron here, for that wrist plate, there's, the wrist is not that long. So oftentimes on the reproductions that have way too much space, way too long. Okay, so the butt plates on these guys. Well, the butt plates are fairly easy to fit because they're fairly straight. There's a big crescent. So you can cut the back end of the stock fairly straight and take your butt plate and actually more or less inlet it down. Because if you get that wood straight, it's going to fit the butt plate pretty well on the back. And by then, you just have to worry about bringing that return down into the wood, inletted into the wood. So they're not terribly hard to inlet. When you look at the longland patterns, which have a longer tang return, and then they have that little swell and button at the end, those you've got to inlet straight down. You cannot go forward with them, because if you do, you're going to have a gap behind the little button. So you have to go straight down with them. So the first thing you do is you get that end of the buttstock good and straight with the butt plate, and then you just inlet this thing straight down into the wood. It's not that hard to do, but you need to kind of know some of those tricks to be able to do it efficiently. And these butt plates are held on by a screw in the heel and down by the toe, and then there's a cross clip that goes through a lug. Yeah, I can't see the lug in any of these. The lug that holds the return in, a metal cross clip. Shaping of the wrist and around the lock area, all Brown Besses, even up into the last patterns, all have this sort of little apron around them, raised apron. And unlike what you see in the reproductions, that raised apron is concave in shape. It's not just this toe of raised wood. No, it's actually got a nice concave shape so that the edge of it is not actually very high above the surrounding wood. It's actually pretty low. They also have not a whole lot of wood left on the stock. The baluster wrist, this is called a baluster wrist. This may look complicated, that long crease. It actually is not. It's actually quite simple to make. This is, oh, sorry, I'm moving ahead. I'll get back to that in a minute. The ramrod pipes, the forward pipe sometimes gives people heartburn. It's really not very hard to inlet. With just a couple of round gouges, it can go in pretty quick and easy. It's held in by 2 pins, and it's not really terribly difficult to put in. I wouldn't hesitate to try it. Don't be intimidated by it. On original Besses, the rear pipe will have a retaining spring. None of your modern made guns have a retaining spring. That's why so many of them, when they tip the muzzle down, the ramrod falls out. This retaining spring is just riveted to the rear pipe, and it holds the metal ramrod in tighter. You don't see this on the wooden ramrod versions, but you do on the metal ramrod versions. Yeah, okay. The swell at the rear ramrod pipe is not terribly hard to do either. And it, as I said before, it is a swell that goes out to the side and not down. So it's basically 2-dimensional. And it gets smaller the later you get. So from the 1730s, it's big and round. As you get to the pattern 1769s, it gets smaller and more of a probably a lemon shape or lemon size. Okay, so the baluster wrist. The baluster wrist is not terribly hard to cut. What you do is you cut away all the excess wood on the comb, this portion. And then all I do is I take a big round gouge. I gouge out the wood right down here, as you can see up here. Then I square that off to a crease using a skew chisel. This is actually, I'm working on a Pedersoli that I'm trying to turn into something that's a little more historically accurate, but I essentially do it the same on a blank anyway. You just hit it with a skew chisel, and then you can use, I have what's called a little bottoming file. The bottoming file is just a file that comes down, bends down, and has a little short file section that you can get down to the bottom of mortises and platinum. I just run that right along that crease, and pretty much in about 20 minutes it's done. Because that crease is a right angle on a Bess. Unlike a Fowler, English Fowler, which is a radius, this is an actual crease. It's not terribly hard to produce. Okay, let's move on to coloring and stocks a little bit. One of the problems you're going to run into is if you build a Brown Bess is that they were originally built with English walnut. It'll make those Pedersoli owners very happy to know that during the Revolutionary War, when the British was running out of walnut, they imported a whole bunch, in fact, most of it, from Italy. so your Italian Bess is not all that off the mark. But anyway, basically, you're going to end up having to use American black walnut because the English walnut's going to be hard to find in that length that you need, and it's going to be so expensive. But you can make American black walnut look like English walnut with a few simple tricks. The piece you see up at the top is black walnut just with finish on it, no staining at all. It's got a cold brown color. The piece below has been first painted with an aniline dye, yellow dye, water-based dye. And then I've added to that alkanet root, which I've infused in mineral spirits. So in other words, I go first with the yellow, then I go with the alkanet root and the reddish tone, and then I paint on the finish I'm going to put on the guns. And on the finish on these guns was not linseed oil. Some people will say, they just dipped them in and say, no, they did not. The finish on these guns is not that dull, sort of modern M1 look. No, these were semi-glossy. It was a varnish. They would never have put a finish on a gun that would take months to dry. They would put a finish on a gun that would dry fast. So it was a linseed oil varnish that was mixed linseed oil with a copal resin, and it's slightly glossy. In this case, I use polymerized tung oil, Southern Oil's polymerized tung, which I can match any finish, any original finish, very closely. But those two staining tricks will turn that black walnut into something that looks very close to English walnut. And these are just some guns I have done. This is a pattern 1730/40 or upgraded version. Black walnut stock, stained the way I told you. All the parts and components for the rifle shop. This is an excellent shooting gun. It's a little heavy, but it's a pretty darn good shooting gun. This is another bit more detail. You can see the carving around the barrel tang has a little bit of a waviness to it on this early pattern. But these were the most decorated of all the Brown Besses. After this, they become simpler and simpler and simpler. This is a gun that I took mostly Pedersoli parts and with a few additions such as a butt plate, and I had to also use a new trigger guard. But I turned the lock into a Dublin Castle lock and made a Dublin Castle shortland pattern of 1769 shortland pattern. Black walnut stock. And you can see it does not look like black walnut. It definitely has the color that is more consistent with English walnut. But this is one of the problems that I have when I'm making these muskets is because the procedures that I use to make guns, I've got so rote that to make precise, tightly, cleanly made guns, I actually make the Besses better than the originals, and that's a problem. I actually have to work at making them look cruder. And it's by default. The way I work, it comes out crisp and clean. So I actually have to make them look a little bit cruder, and I have to work at it. Because the finish on these guns and the final details on the stocks themselves, they didn't concern themselves with too much. So things like the lock panels are not real sharp. They could be really rounded down, uneven. The sides could be uneven. You were not necessarily going to see something like what they would do on an English Fowler, high-end English Fowler on a Brown Bess musket. The finish itself on the originals might just be with a fine file. They might have used some scrapers and a fine file, and that's it. No sandpaper, no final, fine scraping. Pretty much a fairly crude and simple finish. They are often engraved with regimental indicators, numbers, company numbers, rack numbers. If you choose to do that, this one I did for this individual with his Dublin Castle. The fonts that are used for that, well, sometimes they're done by the regimental, somebody at the regiment level, sometimes by the Tower of London. But generally the font is from an old style from William Caslon. C-A-S-L-O-N. That was the font. He was a type maker in the 18th century. And he did a lot of the engraving for the British government. And that's typically what the font is that you'll see on these guns that are relatively well engraved. Some are pretty crude because they were done by some regimental blacksmith or armorer who did them. And you notice this one's 419. which has significance if you know American history. This is a Pedersoli that I've totally reworked to turn it into in this case, ultimately this was turned into a Dublin castle. That lock was remade over a few months later after this picture was taken. But this is about the best you can do in reworking a Pedersoli Bess. And you can make it a whole lot better than it comes from the factory, but because the butt plate is still too small, and this whole butt section is going to be small, there's only so much you can do. You can only make things closer to the originals just so far, and the rest of it, there's nothing you can do about it without completely restocking the gun. And that's it. I put there, if you, it's kind of hard for people to copy that down. I can email it to folks or whatever. That's a link to a thread that I posted on reworking your Pedersoli Bess. It's a very detailed thread that covers a lot of the details I've talked about today. But I would recommend that you consider looking at that thread if you've got a reproduction you want to try to work over and make a little more historically correct. And that's about it. I'll take questions. One thing I just want to mention to you guys. So we're talking about, government issued firearms. And in the colonies, particularly during the French and Indian War, they were desperate for arms. And some of the colonies themselves actually contracted with the private makers in England, a lot of times the London makers, to make them muskets. New Jersey, New York did a lot of this. I believe Carolina did too.
Connecticut.
Yeah. So this is a commercial musket made for the state of New Jersey. Jim made this, and it's got slightly different hardware, smaller butt. It kind of looks a bit more like some of the reproductions in terms of the dimensions. It is slimmer and smaller, but these were made, and if you're reenacting or you're trying to reproduce that time period during the French and Indian War, these would have been fairly common amongst provincial troops. This is a lock. The name of the lock says Wilson, for Richard Wilson from London. This is a good example of what they look like. Most of these New Jersey muskets are at the bottom of Lake George near Sabbath Day Point. There are still a few of them that probably still hang in there, or at least parts of them still hang in there. But this is a good example that Jim made of what a commercial musket would have looked like, patterned on the Brown Bess, and fitted up the way a Brown Bess would have been fitted. And that is, they're not too worried about cosmetics, but everything in it has to work well. And I'm sure everything in this works well. Right, Jim? Okay. Any questions? Yes?
First, I'd like to say that was an excellent presentation.
Sure, thank you.
Online, that was amazing. I know that I think it's Henry Fielding is the first example, the first mention of Brown Bess. And you see it, there's the poem that goes around about that. But I would always say these are middling references. I've never seen a reference to a common soldier mentioning that term. It's either a firelock or a king's arm or simply, our muskets.
Yeah.
They don't say, and I'm just wondering if you've ever come across
No, I never have. Never have. It's always been like kind of a letter home at most. Yeah. No, I don't think it ever really was ever called Brown Bess as an official title at all. That it might have in the 19th century, but not during its service life. I don't think so. I mean, there were sayings like "married to Brown Bess," "hugging Brown Bess," but no, we call it that now because it's a nice romantic. It's better to say King's Musket, Brown Bess, and then we can give it all kinds of mythological reasons. Yes.
Are they all 69 caliber smoothbore?
No, they are all 75, 76, 77. The French muskets were 69. However, you would use a 69 ball in battle, a much smaller ball, without a patch. That's just for speed loading. So you would be lucky to hit what you're aiming at 50, 60 yards.
How did they just fall right? Like if you lean the barrel down, would it just roll right?
No, because they would have a paper so you have a paper cartridge,
All right, bite the end off the paper, you put a little powder in the pan, close the prison, put the powder down the barrel, take the ball out, throw the ball down there, put the paper on top, ram it down, the paper on top would hold it in place.
So there was no gas seal there at all?
Not much, I mean, a good soldier would be able to fire about 4 rounds a minute. The idea was volley fire, not aiming, and accuracy. And though it's a misnomer to think they didn't care about accuracy at all, the British soldiers practiced, and they valued marksmanship. And the better shooters sometimes were put into what we call the light infantry, the light bobs. Some of them were pretty formidable shooters. And in addition, the light bobs learned very quickly how to take out American riflemen. We have this mythology of the Superman American rifleman, and that's just bunk. The British had fears of American riflemen early in the war, largely because of PR campaign by General Washington, sending out letters back to England that said, riflemen are the biggest widow makers in the world, and blah, 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 blah. Well, very shortly, the riflemen around Boston were so much trouble to him that he was absolutely happy to send them off with Benedict Arnold to Canada and get rid of them. And when they came back, and Morgan came back after being captured at Quebec, and he created the Provisional Rifle Corps, which is what we call Morgan's Rifle Corps. They were very valuable. They performed it very valuable. But they had to be protected by infantry, or the British troops and Hessians would run right through them. And they learned with their light infantry that if they just move fast, the Americans might get a couple volleys off, but then if they just move fast with their bayonets, their riflemen would run away or be killed, because they could sustain a few casualties early on and hit them with the fast motion. And they took advantage of it. They basically neutralized the riflemen pretty well.
It was just the amount of time to load.
Yeah, you might be firing like a shot a minute maybe with a rifle. You might go faster, but it'd be tough.
I've got a lot of thoughts on how they arrived at the symmetry, not the symmetry, sort of basic design, I guess.
Right.
And what are your thoughts on that, especially arriving at 46 inches?
Well, that I think they borrowed mostly from the Dutch. And it's you have to put it in the context of British history. They had a Dutch king for a long time who had connections with the Netherlands. They did a lot of trade with the British had a love-hate relationship with the Netherlands. I mean, they hated them after De Ruyter sunk their navy in 1672. They loved them when they were fighting the French papists, later on. And then when William became King of England. So there's a love-hate relationship, but they borrowed a lot from the Dutch. They also imported a tremendous number of Dutch firearms in the early part of the 18th century because they were desperate. The kernel system could not keep up, and the quality of the arms was terrible. And so in fighting these new wars on the continent, they had no other option than to import them from either Holland. They couldn't get them from Liège because that was French now, part of France. So they had to go to Holland, and they imported a lot of them. So there was a strong Dutch influence. I mean, the first trigger guard on the Brown Bess, the first pattern that was selected, that's really a Dutch guard. I mean, you'll find that on Dutch military guns, even some civilian guns. That virtually same guard, and kind of the butt plate itself too, very similar. But they then took it on their own and put their own little details in there. But Dollop had a big influence. And it's so funny that the Brown Bess, the iconic British musket, was basically created by a Dutchman and a Frenchman. Immigrants. Those darn immigrants. Get you every time. And so it's a really wonderful history, actually. Yeah. Well, thank you all.